Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar today. We have the webcam on right now just so that you can see that we are here live in the MHS studio. I'm here with Dr. Sam Goldstein, who's flown in for this event. We will be turning the webcam off during the presentation, but we think it's nice to have it on at the beginning just so that we can be here and say hello. Okay, so hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Lindsay Erst, and I'm the lead research scientist here at MHS, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Behavioral Assessment of Youth, where comorbidity is the norm, not the exception. I have a few logistics to go over with you before we get started. So you all are on mute so that the background noise is kept to a minimum, but we do want your questions. So there's a question pane in the panel on the right-hand side. Some of you have been using it already, and you can feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we're going to do our best to get to as many of them as we can. We will be holding questions till the end. We have added this presentation in the handout section of the webinar panel as well, as some of the sample reports are going to be there and the presentation slides as well. If you had any trouble or difficulty downloading those slides, not to worry. This is being recorded and you will get a link to the recording as well as a link to all of the resources that will be available to you. And please feel free to share the video with any colleagues who are unable to attend the live version. We are giving out continuing education credits for this webinar. So in the next day or so, you're going to receive an email with a link that asks for your feedback on this program. And once you submit your feedback, you will be prompted to generate your certificate that will provide you with the CE credits and the information that you need. So now just a little bit about who we are for those of you who are meeting us for the first time. MultiHealth Systems is a global publisher of scientifically validated assessments in the clinical, education, public safety, and talent assessment markets. We're located in Toronto, Canada, and have been in business for over 30 years. We publish assessments in over 50 languages and have a presence in 75 countries around the world, so we are truly global. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Sam Goldstein. He's an assistant clinical instructor at the University of Utah School of Medicine and on staff at the University Neuropsychiatric Institute. He's a licensed psychologist and has been nationally certified as a school psychologist. He is the clinical director of the Neurology, Learning, and Behavior Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. And Dr. Goldstein has authored over 50 texts as well as over 50 book chapters and 24 peer-reviewed research articles. He currently serves as an editor-in-chief of the Journal of Attention Disorders and sits on the editorial boards of 6 peer-reviewed journals. He is the co-developer of many psychological tests, and I encourage you to visit his website for a wide range of resources and more information. So again, a big thank you to you, Dr. Sam Goldstein, for making the journey to our MHS studio today and for your presentation.
Thanks very much, Lindsay, and a thank you to all of you. I guess I should say good morning, good afternoon, good late afternoon, good evening, good late evening, and for some of you, good very, very early morning. I'm very pleased and honored that today we have over 1,000 people on the line from 5 different continents. So I will do my best to try and effectively make use of the time and provide you with information that is practical and applicable, things you can use in your practice in schools, in clinics, and in your work in the community. Let's get right down to our learning objectives so that everyone knows what it is we're trying to accomplish. I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing our role as evaluators. What is it we do, and why do we do it, and how can we do it effectively? One can exert a wide range of energy in an activity and be ineffective. And for us, as clinical evaluators, the goal is to invest our time wisely, to use tools and methods and ideas and theories that allow us in a reasoned and reasonable and a scientifically valid way to reach our goal, and that is understand the child, see the world through the eyes of the child, both from a diagnostic and an eligibility perspective, but also with the end goal in mind of intervention. We evaluate to identify problems, but ostensibly we evaluate to make things better for the child and for their families. We'll briefly talk about development and behavior and diagnosis. We're going to focus on both diagnosis and eligibility, and we'll discuss the differences between the two of them. We'll discuss briefly comorbidity and why it is the case that today as evaluators it is uncommon to evaluate a child or teen and arrive at a single diagnosis or a single eligibility determination. Comorbidity seems to be the rule rather than the exception, and I'll offer you what I think is an understandable foundation for why that's the case for children. Then we'll talk a little bit about a comprehensive assessment. What kinds of things should you look for? It's not just a matter of giving tests and scoring them. One has to consider the environment the child lives in. One has to consider a wide range of variables in regards to the assessment methods, in regards to statistics, and we'll briefly review some of those issues that need to be kept in mind throughout any assessment process. And then we'll talk about some critical variables that influence assessment, including the tools that we're using and the methods that we're using to apply those tools. What I'm going to provide are the tools that I like, the tools that I find to be the best developed. They are published by multiple publishers, not just Multi-Health Systems, and we'll talk about those tools, and I'll help you understand a foundation and a rationale for why you choose one kind of a tool and why you might then choose other tools based on the data generated from the first tool. And finally, we'll talk about how to integrate the information into a cohesive framework and present it to stakeholders, whether those stakeholders are parents or educators or individuals in the community. So we have our work cut out for us in the hour and a half we have together. I'll do my best to get through the material. You can tell from my accent that I am not from South Africa or London. I'm from New York City originally, and I now live in Salt Lake City, where I direct a clinic in which we see about 400 children and about 150 adults yearly. About half have brain injuries. Others have a variety of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral challenges, many of them with genetic bases. And we'll talk a little bit about the pattern of children's presentation today, and again, why we're seeing such a higher rate of comorbidity. I do speak quickly, and I apologize for those of you that find my pace a bit fast. I'll make an effort to not go so fast that I'm unintelligible, but we do have a lot to get to today. So when I meet a child, the first test I administer is the bus test. And if you Google it, you won't find it anywhere on the web. The bus test is very simple. I ask myself, if I was sitting on a bus next to this child, could I do it? And if I could do it, for how long could I tolerate it? And on a bus, children have two kinds of problems. Their behavior either disturbs us, and we've come to call that externalizing, or worries us, and we've come to call that internalizing, meaning we can sit next to the child, they don't bother us, but as we observe them, we are worried and concerned about their welfare. Now, this bus test reflects the work of earliest developmental researchers beginning about 70 years ago, John Weary and his colleagues, in which they attempted to create a workable framework for understanding the behavioral and emotional and developmental problems that children exhibit. And their first look at this was to appreciate that children do in fact exhibit two kinds of problems, those that disrupt or disturb us and those that are more internalizing and worry us. And then Tom Achenbach and his conceptualization of the Child Behavior Checklist took that framework and created a broad spectrum tool. And we'll come back to talking about tools in a little while, and we'll come back to talking about this discrepancy model in terms of how different does a child have to be in order to label their behavior as problematic. And we'll discuss the increasing focus on impairment and not just symptoms and symptom severity. But before we look at that, I have one more thing for you to consider. I had a revelation in St. Augustine. I was in St. Augustine with my children many years ago, and we were touring a series of buildings that had been constructed to help visitors understand what the city of St. Augustine might have looked like 400 years ago. And I hit my head on a door jamb. And my revelation was not that I had a visit with a Holy Mother or saw Jesus or God, but rather my revelation was that people were fairly short 400 years ago, and therefore door jambs were fairly low. And I, as someone of 5 feet 6 inches height, would have been considered a tall person at that time. And so we assign resources based on need. The world operates along a normal curve meaning most people are in the middle, and some people are at each extreme, with a diminishing number of people as you move out to each extreme. And if we're talking about something good, like how often you listen to your mother, you'd like to be at the top or at the head of the bell curve. If we're talking about something bad, how often you annoy your mother, you'd like that to be minimal. You'd like to be at the back of the bell curve. And everything we do as clinicians, as school psychologists, neuropsychologists, mental health professionals, reflects that normal curve. We take a history based on what we know about families and place them within a context. We use self-report and observer report measures that today are standardized along a normal curve, whether it's percentiles or standard scores. We use intervention tools and assess the success of those tools based on a normal curve. There are just two things we do that are not based on a normal curve, and the normal curve I refer to as dimensional, meaning where are you in the dimension of the normal curve. There are two things we do that are categorical, and that is diagnosis and determination of eligibility. Think about it. A diagnosis, whether it's in the DSM or the ICD or whatever diagnostic system you might be using other than those two, is an absolute statement. You either meet the criteria or you do not. There's no maybe. In the DSM, we have a term now referred to as unspecified, which means you have some of the symptoms and they cause you impairment. In the old system, it was called not otherwise specified. But diagnoses are categorical, yes or no. And if you have 4 of a required 5 symptoms, you don't receive the diagnosis, even though you might need help. We will talk about that. And the second thing we do that is not dimensional, that is categorical, is determine eligibility for a particular program, as in special ed services in North America, in Canada, or the United States, or special ed programs in what the British refer to as their public schools. A determination of eligibility is needed because these programs only have limited space, and there have to be some criteria to determine whether you cross a threshold to enter that space. And diagnosis alone in these systems, particularly in schools, is insufficient to determine eligibility. May be necessary as part of the determination, but in and of itself in the schools, for example, in and of itself is not sufficient. So keep that in mind. We as evaluators are uncomfortable with categories. We fret over them. Does a child meet a diagnosis? And most of us, because we dedicate ourselves to help, will err on the side of being more liberal as opposed to more conservative. We'll err on the side of being more sensitive, assigning a diagnosis or an eligibility when a child is close because we think that's the way to help them, as opposed to denying the child the diagnosis or eligibility because the child, in our mind, hasn't exactly crossed some particular threshold. And we will come back and talk about that a little bit as well in the time we have together. So first, the disruptive continuum, and I refer to it as a continuum because there is a good range of developmental research that suggests that children with difficult temperament are at greater risk to develop future disruptive problems. Maybe it's them. Maybe it's how we respond to them. We're much more empathic and sensitive and supportive of a 2.5-year-old that sits on the couch when his family comes to visit and looks at a book than we are of a 2-year-old that races through the house, creating havoc and perhaps destroying something we greatly value. And there was a time 30 or 40 years ago when temperament was a primary way we looked at children. Some of you remember the child with impulsive temperament or shy temperament or difficult temperament. And we didn't pathologize as much as describe those biological bases that drove the child's behavior. And we guided parents to learn the child's temperament and respond to the child accordingly, much the same as a horse whisperer responds, as it were, to the horse's temperament. Children with difficult temperament are at risk to develop what we refer to as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Not every child with difficult temperament develops that, but there's a significant percentage of children with difficult temperament whose behavior eventually leads to this categorization or a suspicion of this. And here we're talking about the combined type of ADHD for difficult temperament. If we're talking about the inattentive type, perhaps the shy, quiet, a more withdrawn child may be more at risk for that. Some children with attention deficit, a significant percentage in the research, probably 60%, progress to saying no before they even think about what it is they're refusing to do. We've come to refer to that as oppositional defiance. And finally, about 30% of those children develop what we refer to as conduct disorder, which are a group of offenses that will get children in trouble. Some are status offenses, things that get children in trouble but don't get adults in trouble, such as consuming alcohol. Others are offenses that would get anyone in trouble regardless of age. And it's not the case that every child with conduct disorder started with difficult temperament. Some children develop conduct disorder independent of developing the first three. But as the environment plays a role, increasingly as children get older, the environment plays a greater and greater role in determining risk for these diagnoses, and temperament plays less of a role. If you have trouble remembering this pattern, I think of the child with attention deficit as the Robin Williams, and the child with oppositional defiance as the Clint Eastwood, Make My Day, and the child with conduct disorder as James Dean, as it were. So I sometimes use actors to help parents understand the differences between these children. The child with attention deficit acts without thinking. The child with oppositional defiance sometimes acts without thinking, but more often has a thought in his head that is contrary to what the adult or educator wants. And the child with conduct disorder, for whatever reason, seems to be bent on violating the rules that are placed in front of them. The non-disruptive continuum, and those of you that look at this will realize it's not a continuum. It's more of a flow chart. But there are children who have shy, slow-to-warm-up temperaments, and they are at greater risk when we look at infant research of infants who are startled easily and respond anxiously. Their nervous systems are set as if they were in a dark alley in a bad neighborhood in the middle of the night. And they respond to the environment much more anxiously and at a lower threshold than others. And while depression is considered a lack of confidence, a loss of confidence, as it were, a sense of hopelessness or helplessness, I look at it as a tendency to see the world through mud-colored glasses, and anxiety is a lack of confidence in predicting outcome. In large-scale population-based studies, depression and anxiety are two sides of the same coin. It's rare to find someone who's anxious or worried that isn't depressed or unhappy, and vice versa. Keep in mind the same medicines are used to treat both conditions, and the same kinds of counseling are used to treat both conditions. And then we have learning problems, which we will not spend much time on today. Children with reading difficulties that can be phonemic-based or orthographic-based, and then children with social problems, and in this case I'm referring to autism as a social learning problem, and that too has a strong basis in temperament and development. So this is the basic conceptualization I use, and I start when I take a history by considering the nature of the child's behaviors, and I listen for what parents tell me. There's no shortcut to taking a history other than following the child around for a week, and sometimes when I offer to do that or I suggest that, parents quickly want to take me up on my offer. Real-world behavior always trumps what we see in our playrooms, in our exam rooms, or even what parents report to us to some extent. So this is the framework I start, and when I take a history, I may divide a piece of paper in half, and as I hear parents discussing the child's behavior, I may make a list of behaviors I think are non-disruptive and behaviors that are disruptive. And I will tell you, the most challenging child to work with is the child that presents with both disruptive and non-disruptive behaviors, because the anxious, unhappy child who's also oppositional and perhaps hyperactive. When you try and set firm limits for that child, they become more emotional. When you try and respond empathically to that child, they become more disruptive. Those children are a challenge for parents and for educators, but they can be effectively treated when their problems are well defined and well understood. How shall we understand and categorize problems? I like to think back on who was the first person that thought of a particular issue. And I think back on who were the first people 100, 150 years ago who thought about how shall we consider these problems in children. And that first bullet point there, by etiology or cause, remember phrenology. When we thought we could touch the bumps on a child's head or anyone's head and understand their problems. Or remember body types, endomorphs, ectomorphs, mesomorphs, when we thought that body type predicted the kinds of behavior or emotion or learning someone might demonstrate. And we've now moved on to genetics. And while we identify genes that are associated with different disorders, we also now understand that these disorders that we define behaviorally and statistically have more overlap genetically than we ever imagined. How about the second one? By emotions, by ability, innate qualities children bring to the world, by behavior, by thought. This is how we do it now. Why we do it this way, again, historically is unclear, but we're increasingly recognizing the third one. We're increasingly recognizing that two people could be equally depressed. One doesn't leave the house, the other one goes to work. We're increasingly recognizing that while many of us may demonstrate symptoms of many of these conditions, even as adults, absent having the full disorder, the real target is impairment, and we're going to talk about that. And if you know the DSM-5 or the ICD, you know that impairment is the first question you ask when it comes to mental health, behavioral, and developmental problems. If someone is hyperactive and impulsive and inattentive, but in fact, and I guess it's possible, they don't have impairment, they don't receive a diagnosis. Let's make a short distinction between diagnosis, which is a process of gathering data by one kind of examination or multiple types, and making a decision as to whether someone crosses a categorical threshold that you have a diagnosis. Let's look at eligibility, and for us, particularly in North America, eligibility is an issue because eligibility is the process the schools go through, not diagnosis, eligibility, to determine if a child qualifies to be placed in a certain program or to receive certain services. So diagnosis tells me perhaps where you are and why you're there. Eligibility determines whether you qualify to receive a service. And as an example, a child may have a diagnosis of autism from the community and yet not be eligible to receive services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act as a child with autism in the schools if they don't demonstrate sufficient impairment. And vice versa. There are school districts around the country that will serve children under IDEIA as autistic, even absent a community-based diagnosis for autism. So it's important to keep that in mind when completing an assessment. Am I evaluating initially to make diagnoses, or am I evaluating to determine eligibility, or in some cases, both? I'll tell you my bias is that schools and school psychologists should evaluate for eligibility, but should not place themselves in a position of determining diagnosis. And my primary reason is families typically do not want to share personal information with school personnel. You simply are not privy to the kinds of history that's needed to make a reasoned and reasonable and valid and reliable diagnosis. Let's take a step aside for a moment and ask, and I mentioned earlier, how distinct are these disorders from each other? And we are increasingly recognizing that as you try and parse these diagnoses into smaller and smaller groupings, you have more and more overlap. And so the disruptive, non-disruptive, internalizing, externalizing system is a good place to start as you try and break it into smaller parts, including things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, predominantly inattentive versus impulsive versus combined presentation, you unfortunately have more and more overlap. I won't belabor the issue, but take a look at this slide. I apologize that there's no legend for this. ASD is autism spectrum disorder. ODD is oppositional defiance. CD is conduct disorder. ANX is anxiety, depression, and these are generalized anxiety and unipolar depression, and learning disability, which is a mixed group of math, reading, writing, and spelling, and then the column on the left. And you can see just the overlap between conditions like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, or ADHD and oppositional defiance. And these are estimates that I've created from looking at recent literature. So that's how I came to these numbers. It wasn't a single study, and if listeners are interested, I can make a reference list available. Conduct disorder, anxiety, depression, and again, how much is the genetic overlap? How much is the experiential or behavioral overlap? A lot of this is research that has to be completed. Look at the overlap between autism spectrum and learning disability, and for a lot of those children, it is mathematics. In our research, we find that children with autism spectrum struggle with planning, and planning is a key neuropsychological ability necessary for efficient application of mathematics. And look at ODD and learning disability, and I think that's the frustration over time that children with learning disability experience that eventually leads them to be oppositional, maybe not in a violent or aggressive way, but certainly in a passive way. So a lot of overlap between these conditions, which is why I say it is the rule rather than the exception. And if you're only looking for ADHD, then you're really not doing your job. And if you're only evaluating for anxiety or depression, then you're really not doing your job. You must start with an overview, regardless of what the referral rationale is, with an overview of keeping the referral in mind. Does this child have autism or ADHD? But then starting with a broad view, a helicopter view as it was, to appreciate and understand risk for any condition. So comorbidity is the rule rather than the exception. And by comorbidity, here I mean the co-occurrence of not just multiple diagnoses or multiple eligibilities, but the co-occurrence of internalizing and externalizing behaviors, the co-occurrence of a broad range of behaviors. And to truly understand the child and to see the world through the eyes of the child requires not just reaching a diagnosis. That's a good first step, not a good place to finish, but a broad delineation of the child's strengths and weaknesses. Given that the DSM is polythetic, and by that I mean like a Chinese restaurant menu, 2 from column A, 2 from column B, 6 from column C, as it were, not every child with a diagnosis has the same set of symptoms, or for that matter, the same set of consequences caused by those symptoms. And that knowledge, understanding the symptoms, understanding the consequences, is critical to designing effective intervention. And what is the goal of this assessment, as I've begun? It's more than just identifying symptoms. It is identifying strengths and weaknesses. Ability, and abilities are hardwired. Not that biology is destiny, it just affects probability. If you're well coordinated, you'll acquire athletic knowledge quicker than someone who's not. But slow is fast enough. Someone who's poorly coordinated can still learn to ride a bicycle or swing a golf club. But saying that you're well coordinated and a good athlete doesn't necessarily equate to being skillful in the real world, skillful in competition. You could be anxious. You could be unmotivated. So I want to know your abilities. I want to know your knowledge. And knowledge is more than just reading and math. Language is knowledge. Never speak to a child. Regardless of their genetics, they'll never talk. Socialization is knowledge. Never provide a child with opportunities to socialize, either with peers or with adults, and they don't know how to do it. Genes alone are insufficient for these complex behaviors, and therefore a broad assessment has to look at the environment, has to consider the adults the child interacts with, has to consider the community and the educational system. And the goal of our assessment is not just to go to a unitary condition, but to broadly understand where this child is, how this child is, and why this child is in a particular environment. And finally, as I've alluded to earlier, and I'll emphasize again and again, to define functional impairment, and we will speak briefly about how impairment is different from adaptive behavior in a few moments. So what are the components of a thorough assessment? They appear on your screen there, and the darkened categories are the ones we will have time to cover today. I hope in another webinar to spend time on ability, which we just discussed, those biologically based qualities that are not evenly distributed among us. We're not computers. We're not Stepford Wives, if you know that. Remember that movie? Ability is not evenly distributed. We'll talk a little bit about 4 basic abilities today and a way to assess them through the teacher's eyes, but we won't talk about face-to-face ability assessment or academic assessment or emotional or personality assessment or the interview with the student. We will talk about broad spectrum questionnaires, which ask a few questions about a lot of issues to get you in the ballpark. We'll talk about the importance of assessing impairment, risks and strengths, and executive function. And then we'll talk about some narrow spectrum questionnaires that when you have a concern about autism or anxiety or depression, I'll tell you about the instruments that I like and offer the rationale for why I like them beyond who sells them or who created them. But you always begin with a history. As I pointed out, history is your most valid ecological means of understanding the child. And typically I like both parents to come for a history. Sometimes mom does the reporting and dad is the supervisor, and he'll chime in every once in a while explaining that he's not home much during the day. I like to take a history by having parents fill something out before we meet, including the broad spectrum questionnaires and those for impairment, risk, and executive functioning. There are a number of instruments. John March and Keith Connors have a tool for taking a history. Mel Levine had a tool that before he passed away he sold to take a history. I don't use a narrow history form, meaning there are history forms that are created just to evaluate conditions like autism. They take a long time, and when you're done, if the child is demonstrating other problems, you're really not in the ballpark to know that. So that, for me, is the components of a thorough assessment. It can't be done in a half hour. I typically spend between an hour and 2 hours taking a history. I will typically spend 4 to 6 hours evaluating the child, and then time, of course, to integrate the data. Here are my guidelines for a comprehensive evaluation. One, and as I'm taking a history, I try and keep these issues in mind. I want to make a distinction between what are acute problems and chronic problems. So when a parent tells me the child is wetting the bed, I'd like to know if they've always been wetting the bed or something happened and they regressed. When a parent tells me that their child has stopped speaking, I'd like to know were they speaking before, and if so, the level of their speaking and the level of their regression. Again, it's one of those phenomena that I typically ask about every symptom. Is it chronic or acute as we go through a history? I ask about protective factors, and we're going to look at some of those because I think in the end they are the best predictors of what will happen to a child, not so much the treatments and not so much the diagnoses or eligibility, but rather these other factors within the child and the family and in the extended environment. And I ask about those, and I'm going to take you through those in a minute. I think assessment should be equally focused on strengths and risk. I typically begin my history session by asking parents to tell me something they like about their child, something they believe their child does well. I always try and begin with a strength as a way of setting a foundation for the session. And then I like to present test results to parents as a day in the life of the child. I don't so much talk about scores. I talk about functioning. What do we know about your child from the time they get up till the time they go to bed on a particular day? And what have we learned about what may be driving or explaining that and what we can do about it? And it's always, for me, the least amount of assessment needed to answer the referral questions. And sometimes the referral questions completely come from the parent. And sometimes, as I take a history with parents, we discover that there are other questions that the parent and I would like answered. So let me tell you about this slide. Bob Brooks and I began working together about 20 years ago when we shared a belief that as children transitioned into adult life, strengths were more important than weaknesses. And it was our belief that we were paying lip service to strengths and overly focusing on liabilities, and that more than anything explained why, despite all the services children were receiving, we weren't improving the odds as they transitioned into adult life. And this data comes from one of our textbooks, the Handbook of Resilience in Children. It's an edited volume with authors from all over the world. And what we did was look at studies that were replicated at least twice and looked at qualities that were associated with good coping. We use the word coping. You could use the word resilience or stress hardiness or outcome. Take a look at these. They are intuitive. We joke that it's ordinary magic here that really makes the difference. And when you look at differences in outcome between children in different diagnostic groups, in fact, these kinds of qualities are as good, if not better, predictors than the treatments that children receive. An engaging temperament. There are some children we work with that despite the fact that they may be a challenge for their teachers and their parents, they have a little twinkle in their eye, and they have a way of engaging that makes you like them. Children who are sociable. Children who are autonomous and able to take some responsibility for themselves. Above average intellect. And again, the research here is not so much on intellect as learned behavior, not so much vocabulary or comprehension, but intellect as it relates to planning, simultaneous thinking, sequencing, neuropsychological abilities we use to solve problems. Good reading skills. I had a child who was facing significant stress once tell me that reading was the way that he escaped from the reality of his life. He told me that when he read, he freed the words from the page as if they were prisoners, and those words took him someplace else. High achievement motivation, a positive self-concept, feeling okay about who you are. Impulse control is a powerful one. It is the reason why children with ADHD are at such risk, not so much their inability to pay attention, but rather their struggles to manage their impulses. An internal locus of control, not so internal that you think you run the world, but internal enough to accept responsibility for your behavior. Learning how to plan. Faith, a belief that there is an organization to the world, but most importantly, that there are charismatic adults in your life from whom you can gather strength and will support you. Humor is a powerful protective factor. Why humor evolved? I like to joke that humor evolved because it was a way that attracted women to men. Women like humorous men, and so humor may have evolved because it was a way of perhaps being successful in a date, as it were. And helpfulness. Helping others is a powerful protective factor for those you help and for yourself. And here are some qualities that are associated with the environment. Again, replicated studies, and I'm not arguing that smaller family size is better, but this is what's found. Mothers who are more competent and mentally healthy because they play the primary caregiver role. Supportive siblings, a close bond with a primary caregiver. I had a boy, when I asked him once who he could be, if he could be anybody for a day, and I typically ask kids questions like that. I thought he would answer a sports or a musical or a movie figure. He responded, and this was an 11-year-old, he responded, "My dad." When I asked him why, he said, "You just have to know my dad, he really loves me." And that kind of strength that children gather from a charismatic adult in their lives doesn't come in a pill, and unfortunately doesn't come in special education and doesn't come in therapy. Associated strengths in friendships, forming a few solid friendships during latency and early adolescent years is a powerful protective factor. Supportive teachers, success in school, and giving back to the community. We're seeing a decline in participation in pro-social organizations. I encourage all of the children I work with, either independently or through organized activities, to support others in need in the community. So those are some factors that I think about as I take a history. In fact, I have a list I use, and I go down that list and check them off. And it's been my experience, and therefore it's my belief, that the more of those factors that are in place within the child, in the family, in the community, in a positive way, the more likely it is whatever we do with this child will be successful. And it's also important to keep in mind that these pathways as the late Emmy Werner has said, these pathways are not generic. There is not a single path that every child must go down. Humor may help one child, their academic achievement may help another's, their athletic ability may help a third. Whatever the case may be, it's not a single magic bullet. But those factors are there, and if we look, we can discover that all children at risk possess some of those protective factors that we can build on as part of our intervention and as part of our treatment. A number of critical issues to consider in your assessment. Demographics. By that I mean, where is the assessment taking place? Where does the child live? Perhaps if you live in a dangerous environment, one of the most resilient things you could do as you enter your teenage years is drop out of school and move someplace else. Demographics are critical. A child seen as average in one school may be seen as below average in another school. Symptoms versus consequences. It's another one of those where I divide a line on a piece of paper as I take a history. And I think as parents or teachers are telling me about behaviors, is this a symptom of a particular condition or is this a consequence? Impulsivity is a symptom. Impulsivity has a host of consequences for the child, whether they're young or an adolescent, in terms of how their life is impacted. Category versus dimension, we've talked about. Eligibility versus diagnosis, you have to keep it in mind. We've talked about it. Developmental pathways, and there I mean you have to accept a moment in time. My rule of thumb is the younger the child, the more important this issue is. I joke sometimes offhandedly that all 2-year-olds look like they have bipolar disorder at times. They're quick to be emotional. They're quick to swing in their emotions. They're quick to demonstrate their emotions in overt ways. But that's normal for a 2-year-old. And one has to accept what's normal in a developmental sense, but also accept a moment in time. The younger the child, the more likely it is their patterns of behavior will change. The younger the child, for me, the stronger the symptom presentation needs to be before I'm willing to consider a diagnosis or even suggest to a parent this child is on a particular developmental pathway that may lead to adversity. Keep in mind there are no shortcuts. Simply using a well-standardized questionnaire doesn't preclude taking a history. Simply using a well-standardized questionnaire doesn't preclude interviewing the child or, for that matter, assessing ability, knowledge, and skill. And again, you have to know the environment that the child lives in on a daily basis. What are they being taught? What are they being shown? How do they feel about where they are in life? I always assess for intervention. I always begin with the disruptive and non-disruptive continuum in mind. I keep low incidence problems in mind. I'll come back to the second and third there. What do I mean by low incidence problems? Fragile X, for example. I think it's critical for all school psychologists, clinical psychologists, neuropsychologists, even social workers to have a desk reference of genetic and neurodevelopmental disorders in childhood that affects their behavior and learning. Cecil Reynolds and I have authored a number of such volumes, specifically looking at genetic conditions like Fragile X, or like tuberous sclerosis, or like Williams syndrome that will affect children's development. And some of these conditions are easy to see. They're easy to observe, such as trisomy. That's very easy to see a child with Down syndrome. It's much harder to recognize a child, for example, with Fragile X. So it's important to keep those conditions in mind, and you may be the first evaluator, believe it or not, seeing an 8-year-old child to ask the question, is it possible this child has Fragile X? I always consider protective factors. I always measure impairment. Now, just quickly, positive and negative predictive power and sensitivity and specificity. It's important for you to keep in mind that each of these are critical in the tests that you use. Positive predictive power means what's the probability that a symptom tells you you have the disorder. And negative predictive power means what's the probability that if a symptom is absent, you don't have the disorder. And some symptoms have one or the other. Some symptoms have both. the positive and negative predictive power of each symptom is not equal. And it's important to understand those symptoms that are more powerful in predicting a disorder or not a disorder. And there's always a balance between positive and negative predictive power by sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity means I am going to include everyone who says they have the problem, but I'm willing to accept false positives because I don't want to miss someone. Specificity means I don't want any false positives, even if I have some false negatives. A sensitive test for right-handedness would be assuming everyone is right-handed. You're wrong 15% of the time. A specific test for right-handedness would be to require you to do 30 things, and if you do one thing with your left hand, you're not right-handed. It's important for you to know the positive and negative predictive power and the sensitivity and specificity of the instruments that you use. And the instruments that I'm going to review today, all of these instruments have very good positive and negative predictive power and very good sensitivity and specificity. So there are the components of a thorough assessment. I think I'm close to where I want to be on time. We're going to begin looking at some of these instruments. And we'll go through them quickly. I'm not trying to market them to you. I'm not telling you that you have to use these particular tools. More importantly, I want you to consider this framework, that you take a history, you assess for impairment beyond just asking parents, does he have trouble on the playground? You assess for executive function beyond just asking, does he control his emotions or have a plan? You assess for risk and strengths, and I'll tell you about 3 tools that I like. I also happen to be the author of those 3 tools, but I'm not concerned about whether you use those or you use others. I'd like you to use mine, but that's up to you. We'll touch on the broad spectrum tool that I favor, and I will tell you that Keith Connors, who since passed away, was a mentor of mine. I know Keith for 40 years. I helped him start the Journal of Attention Disorders, which is now a top 25% science journal in the world. And I'm still the editor-in-chief, but I'll tell you about the Connors. But you can use the Basque, you can use the Achenbach, whatever suits you. You need a broad-spectrum tool. I'll tell you about the Connors 3 for disruptive problems, and then we'll look at 4 kinds of non-disruptive, very specific behavioral questionnaires that look at narrow spectrum. And again, we won't talk about assessing achievement and ability, resilience, or personality today. So you got to get a thorough history, and I'm going to not bog down in this. I think most of you know how to do this. I like to start with strengths, and I like to work my way through how the child behaved at different stages, what their friendships are like, what their basic behavior, what treatments they've received, what kind of discipline parents have utilized, and where the child functions well and where they don't function so well. So let's look just quickly at impairment. Why do we need impairment, and how is impairment different from adaptive behavior? What we find, first of all, is that our assumption in the past that diagnoses and symptom severity and test scores tells us everything we need to know about behavior in the real world is erroneous, and that, in fact, all of those variables combined predict less than 50% of what people will do in the world. If you want to know what someone will do in the world, you have to either go out in the world and watch them, and we as school psychologists call that a functional behavioral observation, or you have to ask people who routinely observe them to complete well-standardized instruments to tell you about their level of impairment. But there is a weak relationship between these tests, and there's a clear need to measure impairment. You can't determine a child is eligible for service academically without demonstrating impairment. You can't make DSM diagnoses today or ICD diagnoses without demonstrating impairment. So from my perspective, you must have a measure of impairment beyond just your observation. And for those of you that use the DSM, there was in the older DSM a global impairment scale where you could offer a statistic, a number. It's no longer there. You must have some way of measuring impairment. For me, impairment is the reduced ability to meet the demands of life. Something gets in the way. It could be you have trouble hearing. It could be you have trouble speaking. It could be you're depressed. It could be you're impulsive or inattentive or anxious or depressed. Our research demonstrates that any challenge we face will reduce our impairment in everyday life. The late Tom Oakland, who's the developer of the adaptive behavior system, a very good instrument that we use with children who we have concerns about their broad intellectual and functional development, and I had many a discussion about the difference between symptoms and impairment. And a symptom, for example, of inattention is different than an impairment in completing homework. An impairment can exist absent a formal diagnosis, and in one study, 15% or 14% of children were significantly impaired, but they didn't have a diagnosis. So again, people with diagnoses are impaired, some more than others, and out in the world there are people with impairment who may not have diagnoses. Keep in mind, our goal is not just to diagnose or determine eligibility, but to assist in identifying need for intervention. And how is impairment different than adaptive behavior? I'm not sure why that slide didn't come up, but I'll tell you as you look at this slide of our rating scale of impairment. Adaptive behavior is, for me, a reflection of do you know how to do it? Impairment is an indication of whether or not you do it. And in the adaptive behavior system, in Tom Oakland's system, in the current version, the instructions are if you don't believe a child knows how to do it, you score a 0. If you believe they know how to do it but aren't doing it, then you score somewhere else on the Likert scale. So even Dr. Oakland attempted to make a distinction between impairment, you're not doing it regardless of the reason, and adaptive behavior, you don't know how to do it. This is the rating scale of impairment. We tried to create a tool that was sufficiently brief because we keep creating more and more tools for people to complete. We created a tool that has the fewest number of items to address the issues we're concerned about. And as you look at the scales down below, those scales were created in part by the World Health Organization Standards for Impairment, the HUDAS, and the instrument is standardized on the general population. I will tell you that all of the tools I'm going to talk about are standardized on the census, on the general population per se, so that you have some confidence that you are measuring people and reflecting what is going on in the real world. We seem to have a glitch. There we go. Okay, I apologize. And I'm moving rather quickly. I think the impairment scale, whether it's ours or someone else's, needs to be used as a first-line tool. Look at the impairment scale measure, the correlation, impairment with other measures. This helps us understand that what's being measured, in this case on an impairment tool, the RSI, is different than what's being measured by other tools. If you remember your statistics, we take that number, don't worry about the minus, 0.54, multiply it by itself, and that's about 25. And it tells us that 25% of what's measured on the RSI is also measured on Dr. Oakland's adaptive behavior assessment. But 75% of what each of those tools measures is not measured by the other one. Hence the reason to give the impairment scale. Here's social emotional competency, a very good tool developed by Jack Naglieri and his colleagues. That's almost 50% of an overlap. But still, 50% is not measured. Here's the Comprehensive Executive Functioning Inventory, the CEFI. That's almost 60%. But look, measures of psychopathology, diagnostic measures, content scales, behavioral scales, or symptom scales, correlations are very, very low. And then ability achievement, Wechsler, Woodcock, the cognitive assessment system, they do not predict impairment. If you want to know about impairment, you have to ask and you have to utilize a measure that tells you about that. Now quickly, executive functioning. What do we mean by executive functioning? It's how you do what you do. It's essential for solving problems. It is not knowledge, it is strategy. It is doing all the easy ones first on a math test, controlling your emotions when a project isn't going the way you want it to. Having a plan, organizing information, paying attention to data or to particular aspects of your environment. We now recognize, and I'll show you a slide to support that executive functioning predicts somewhere between 25 and 40% of what people do out in the world. And it's been debated as to whether there are many executive functions or a singular executive function. And I'll make a distinction statistically. And the distinction I'll make is that our research and the large-scale research of others has demonstrated that it is executive function. It's a single phenomena made up of a group of behaviors. And I would not argue that each of these behaviors you see are in and of themselves executive functions, because these behaviors are used for other things besides problem solving. And so they have multiple uses. And so from our view, and I think the review of other researchers, it's executive functioning. And you can see a difference there. Executive functioning problems are not just characteristic of ADHD. So ADHD is not EFDD, executive function deficit disorder. It's not. Look at kids with learning disability, a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15. The blue are the clinical groups, the red are the normal groups. Any challenge you put in front of people will cause them impairment. Any challenge you put in front of people will reduce the efficiency with which they go about engaging in everyday activities. Think about a day when you were in physical pain or something adverse was happening in your life. It was hard to be efficient. And while there's a lot of data on this slide, just to make the point, look at the 4 blue circles. What that tells us is the corrected correlation, because the standard deviations of these tests on the data that we were using here were not identical, so you correct the correlation. What it tells us is the degree to which the behaviors of executive function influence performance on the WISC, the IQ test, the CAS, the neuropsychological measure, and the Woodcock-Johnson total academic achievement. And you'll see 16% on the Wechsler, probably almost 20% on the CAS, and 25% on the Woodcock. What that tells us is how you go about taking these tests is in part predicted by the strategies you use. And I think everyone who administers these tests well recognize that some children are much more strategic in how they complete the tests that we administer them. And this data demonstrates that how they do it contributes anywhere from 16 to over 25% of the effectiveness of their performance. Hence, the importance of measuring executive function in an assessment. And then just quickly, a new test that's just coming to the market that I've created that looks for the first time at protective behaviors and risky behaviors in 9 to 25-year-olds, because we now know that young adulthood is the riskiest time in life. And we've created an algorithm that allows self-report and observer report for a group of risky behaviors, but also for assets or strength-based behaviors. And in our research and the research of others, there seem to be 3 key protective behaviors related to your emotional balance, your interpersonal skill, and your self-confidence. Other instruments or other researchers talk about this using other terms, such as sense of mastery or emotional well-being. The RISE is the first tool to look at these. I would encourage you to take a look at the RISE and to consider using some kind of a protective measure tool. Now, I see that our time is running down. I've got about 15 to 20 minutes, which I think will give us enough time. Here are the broad spectrum measures. Again, you have to use one. If you use the BASC, that's fine. If you use the Child Behavior Checklist, that's fine. The Connors is named after Keith. When he first developed the original item as a research tool, he really didn't want to call it the Connors, and eventually we all referred to it as, well, there's Connors questionnaire, because all of us were using it in research, and eventually it in and of itself became the icon for the tool. Keith was a mentor of mine and a brilliant mind. His tools, his broad spectrum tool, this is the early childhood tool. I don't think there's any better tool to measure behavior, not diagnoses in 2 to 6-year-olds. We're more interested in categories of behavior and that restless, impulsive, emotional lability in measuring that, and these developmental milestones. The early Conners is a good, quick way of getting a parent and a teacher's perspective, well standardized, well normed in those 5 areas. Here's the Conners for older children. And both of these instruments have other adjunctive scales. I'm just showing you the primary scales. These are the content scales. Again, these are not diagnosis but descriptive. These scales are an exceptional place to begin by pulling out sets of behaviors and categories that are needing attention for intervention. These are the symptom scales, internalizing, externalizing. And the autism scale is a good place to start, but even Keith acknowledged that you need a broad spectrum tool to start, but for things like ADHD, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, autism, you really do need narrow spectrum tools. And the Conners will measure other indicators that can be used both to understand the breadth and scope of the child's problems and also to design intervention. And then narrow spectrum tools, do you need them? For me, the determination for a narrow spectrum tool is twofold. Is there a referral for that kind of a problem? 1. And 2, does the broad spectrum tool reflect that? This is the Conners disruptive scale, and it looks at a broad range, including executive functioning, and then zeroes in on the 3 disruptive or externalizing scales we've previously talked about. I encourage you, no matter what instrument you use, to know the instrument, to read the manual, or at the very least, read the first paragraph in each chapter of the manual. It's important to know the tools that you use. This is the Autism Spectrum Rating Scale, developed by Jack Naglieri and I for 2 to 18-year-olds. And you can see we have a total score. This is for the younger children. This is an exploratory factor analyzed tool. It's our belief that all instruments should be first developed with exploratory factor analysis after piloting. What does that do? It allows you to take your hands off the items and really understand how one item may be related to another. And then you create treatment scales. Let me go back here. You create treatment scales where you put items together and demonstrate with confirmatory factor analysis that these items do in fact belong together. It is our belief that these treatment scales cover the breadth and scope of problems that children with autism exhibit at all ages. And the slide you're seeing there, if I go back another slide, this slide really shows you the 6 to 18-year-old. There isn't a self-regulation scale for the younger children because we found that we couldn't accurately measure that all young children in that age range have some degree of restless and impulsive behavior. So we don't have a self-regulation scale. We do have a treatment scale for attention for the younger children. You'll notice this slide says DSM-4. I can tell you that we've now updated our instruments that we develop and that MHS develops live in the cloud. And by that I mean when new instruments come out, new data comes out, we make an effort to update our tools. And so after the ASRS came out, we realized we needed a scale for children who didn't speak. And so we went back into the data and created a scale for children who don't have spoken language. When the DSM-5 came out, we went back into our data set, and luckily we had all of the DSM-5 symptoms in that set and created a scale. So the instruments are living. There's a difference. They are just validity. The top couple of scores are scores on the ASRS for kids with autism. The bottom are clinical and Gen Pop or Gen Population. This is an interesting slide. You'll see the red is ADHD, the blue is autism spectrum. A score of 50 is average, 70s in the top 2%. You'll notice there are 2 spots where kids with ASD and ADHD match up. That is the self-regulation and the attention scales. And so, as many of you suspect, most children with ASD also meet ADHD diagnostic criteria, which is why so many of them find themselves receiving Ritalin or other stimulants, not because it treats the autism as much as it treats the inattentive, impulsive, and hyperactive symptoms that, from my view, are as much part of autism as they are of ADHD. And this slide helps you appreciate, again, that these narrow spectrum tools are good for finding the narrow spectrum disorder. They're not good for finding broad spectrum problems. Just quickly, this is this is John March's anxiety scale. For a long time, the scales we had measured one or two aspects of anxiety. Dr. March has devoted his career to assessing and researching anxiety. I very much like this tool and like the self-reports I receive from children. It gives me a lot of information for my clinical interview. And you'll see a box down there about inconsistency. All of these tools have ways of trying to determine whether the respondent is answering in a consistent, reflective way. I like John's tool because, as you see, it breaks out separation anxiety from social anxiety. It looks at harm avoidance. It really lets you split out anxiety. This is what one of the printouts look like. All of these tools have a variety of options in terms of how the computerized scoring allows you to look at the data. And then depression, Maria Kovacs, who also I consider a mentor. This is the second edition of her tool. There are other self-report depressive instruments. I very much like this one. I like the 4-point Likert scale. I like the way it breaks parent and teacher down to emotional problems and functional problems, and then breaks further down to mood, self-esteem, interpersonal problems, and ineffectiveness. Again, I encourage you to find a tool you like. This is what the CDI looks like. And the self-report is a 0, 1, or a 2. And all of these instruments, again, are developed over a many-year period with lots of refinements, and that's what a scale looks like. Before I run out of time, just quickly, what we don't have good scales for are ways of measuring ability, not achievement, but ability, the neuropsychological phenomena that contribute to how children acquire knowledge and manage that knowledge. This is the late neuropsychologist Luria's model. The CAS is an instrument that was authored by Jack Naglieri and J.P. Das. I joined them for the second edition. It looks at how children plan, how they pay attention to detail, how they think. I don't use the word intelligence much anymore because sometimes I'm not sure what people mean by that, but I do use the word simultaneous. Simultaneous reflects how well you see all of the variables simultaneously to solve a problem. Sequencing is working with information in order. The PASS teacher questionnaire can quickly get you into the ballpark as to what the teacher's seeing in the classroom. Take a look at this slide. I'm not suggesting that the PASS, whether it's the questionnaire or our face-to-face test, the cognitive assessment system, which you're not familiar with, or if you're not familiar with, I suggest you take a look at, because it is a widely used ability measure that is generally free of culture and experience. Aboriginal children in Central Australia, inner-city children in New York City, affluent children in Beverly Hills will all perform the same way at the same ages on this set of tools. And what you can see there is that children with ADHD, the red line, have trouble with planning. It isn't so much they don't pay attention as they don't know how to get from point A to point B, because impulsivity tends to be the core problem for those kids with a combined diagnosis. Look at the blue line, autism spectrum. Believe it or not, attention to detail seems to be their core problem. They don't know what to pay attention to. And finally, specific learning disability, children with phonemic awareness problems, which I consider to be 80% of learning disability, have trouble with sequencing, putting sounds together to make words, words together to make sentences, and so on. I'm not suggesting that this questionnaire will give you the final differential diagnosis, but it gets you in the ballpark, which is the purpose of these narrow spectrum instruments. If the teacher is concerned the child has problems in the classroom, this is a good brief tool that helps you appreciate, is it poor impulse control? Is it a neuropsychological deficit? Is it something like autism spectrum disorder? And finally, when I talk about organizing the data, I talk about a day in the life. With parents, I talk about a day in the life with an educational team around a team meeting. What do we know about this child? What did we know before we began this examination? What do we know now? Not just what causes the child's problems, but a thorough, broad foundation of the child's strengths and weaknesses. I make a distinction, and I think parents and educators understand this and embrace it, between ability, what is inborn, what is biological, between knowledge, what has the child learned, and how have their abilities contributed or not contributed to that, and finally, how skillful are they? For me, skill is not a noun. It's not reading skill. It's not social skill. For me, skill is a verb. It is skillfully reading or skillfully socializing. And all kinds of things interfere with skill. A child may be, again, well-coordinated, a good athlete, not skillful in competition because they're nervous. Another child may have average sequencing and simultaneous ability, possess average reading and written language knowledge, but be skillful in earning good grades in school because they work hard. This is why assessment is more than just questionnaires and tests. This is why assessment is more than just measuring ability and knowledge. This is why assessment takes time. I'm interested in risk and protective factors. I will use whatever standards in whatever system I'm working in to determine eligibility, to suggest possible diagnoses, and if I'm not certain, I'll say provisional, or I'll say rule out, and the distinction between those sometimes is lost between people. For me, provisional means I'm fairly confident you have the problem. Rule out means I'm not that confident. And then I recommend. What can the family do? What can I do? What can the community or the school do? And I consider a continuum of services. And in the schools, we're now using a tier system. These are children, if I've evaluated them, who've received Tier 1 and even some Tier 2 interventions. And finally, I have two things for you to consider. One, my axiom is, as with physicians, we should do no harm. That children should come away from the time they spend with us not demoralized, not defeated, not overwhelmed. We shouldn't lie or cheat or make them feel good because we think somehow an artificial inflation of their feelings will help them in the long run. But we should make the process of assessment something that they enjoy and feel good about. And finally, and I stop because I'm proud of myself, because yesterday when we ran through this presentation, I was 20 minutes too long. Maybe I've spoken 40% faster, who knows. But here's my take on it. We should adopt a learning to ride a bicycle mindset. And when a child has trouble learning to ride a bicycle, we don't scream and yell. We accept that slow is fast enough. We create an environment in which they feel accepted, in which they feel successful. Slow is fast enough. The late Joan Goodman coined that term in discussing children's learning, and I'm a big fan of giving intellectual credit to those who deserve it. It's not my term, but it's a beautiful term. Slow is fast enough. However long it takes, we as evaluators need to help all of the stakeholders appreciate and have a reasonable understanding of what does it take to help this child. Not what does it take to diagnose. Our job isn't done then. What does it take to be eligible? Our job isn't done then. Our job isn't done until we help everyone, including the child, see the world through their eyes in a positive, strength-based way, appreciate their liabilities, and see a path to a functional adulthood. And with that, I will turn it back to Lindsay for some questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. That was a wonderful presentation and right on time. I see your arms in the air cheering for yourself. That was well done. I just need to take over the computer from you now, and we'll just advance.
Oh, there's my TED Talk. Oh. For those of you who haven't seen my TED Talk, I would encourage you to watch it. I thought it would go viral, but it's I got a few 100,000 viewers. It's called The Power of Resilience, and it's a short talk about the children in our clinic, who I joke are Job's children, because they come to our clinic with a host of challenges.
All right, so this does leave us some time for questions, and there have been some great ones submitted, and now's a great time to start submitting questions. If you weren't sending them in throughout the duration of the presentation, I will scroll through some that were sent in. Do you have any reason to prefer the CAS over the KABC, for example?
So let me again disclose, I'm an author of the CAS. I'm not an author of the KABC. And I would advise someone who's looking for a neuropsychological measure based on a Lurian framework that either of those two tests, they're both equally good.
How do you decide which IDEIA classification to assign if there's multiple diagnoses, autism, emotional disturbance, etc.?
This past year, I've had one of my graduate students go through every state reg and then look at differences within states and school districts, and there is not a consistency. In some school districts, the term multiply handicapped requires that one of the handicaps be intellectual deficit, but not in other states. In some states and some school districts, being visually impaired or linguistically impaired cannot be one of the multiple handicaps. So every school district is different, and in fact, in one school district that I polled, their differential for multiply handicapped required that if the child had to leave their educational facility and go to another location to receive services, that was the basis for determining multiple handicap. Some states will use primary and secondary on their IEPs, even though the state requirements is that the school district only provide the primary eligibility. So there isn't a consistent way of doing it. What I suggest is that if in your mind the child meets multiple IDEIA qualifications, that you're well versed in how your school district handles that.
Thank you so much. Apologize. Bear with me as I scroll through these to make sure that we don't offer something that's already been spoken about in the presentation. So you talked a little bit about evaluating executive functioning, and the measures that you put up were for school-age children. What do you recommend, if anything, for evaluating executive functioning in preschoolers?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You can derive data from the NEPSI. You can derive data from the Woodcock Cognitive. But again, my experience has been that the younger the child, the harder it is to convince them that it's really important that they try their best. And so I'm very careful in children under 6, even age 6 to 7, in drawing conclusions about their neuropsychological ability, whether you're using a Cattell-Horn model, a CHC model, whether you're using PASS, which is the Lurian model of the CAS, and the Kaufman will use. I'm just very careful about doing that in young children. But you can use the NEPSI.
Thank you so much. Earlier you did mention a book as a reference for genetic disorders. Can you remind everybody what that book was?
Sure. I mentioned a couple of books. I mentioned a Springer book in 2 volumes, the second volume that Bob Brooks and I did, titled Handbook of Resilience in Children. The other book I mentioned was Handbook, I believe, of Executive Functioning, which is also a Springer book that I co-authored with Jack Naglieri. And the third book I think I mentioned was co-authored with my good friend Cecil Reynolds. And we've authored 3 books in this series of developmental and genetic disorders, 2 on children and 1 on adults. And the latter I suggested as a desk reference. You're not going to see children with low incidence disorders very often, but it's good to have that desk reference available so that when you do, you can provide intelligent responses to parents' questions about these disorders.
Thank you so much. So given that this was a talk focused on the fact that comorbidity is now the rule, not the exception, how do you approach the discussion of comorbidity with parents so as not to overly worry them or overwhelm them?
Very good question. Recall that I mentioned that we started with disruptive, non-disruptive, that once we decided we weren't going to just look at impairment and we weren't going to look at bumps on your head or phrenology, we're going to look at behavior. The earliest delineation was your child has disruptive problems, or your child has non-disruptive problems. And then as we tried to become more finite, partly because it helps in research, and partly because the thought was that perhaps some kinds of behaviors that are disruptive may respond better to certain kinds of treatments than others, we've created more and more categories. The first DSM came out in 1952, the year I was born. There were no childhood disorders in the DSM in 1952. The prevailing belief was that children's brains were not sufficiently developed for them to have mental health disorders. They could be unhappy, but they didn't have a disorder per se. And now we recognize that children do have mental health problems. So what I explain to parents, we start with the disruptive, non-disruptive, and we talk about the overlap in these symptoms, and I try and pick certain patterns of behavior that, as we discussed earlier, are algorithmic, meaning they carry more weight and risk in predicting how concerned we should be about the child's future. And I'm very careful when I talk to parents. The last thing we discuss are the diagnostic labels, and I explain to them that those labels are used either because we need to obtain insurance reimbursement, or we need to determine eligibility for a particular kind of medical treatment or service within school. But we don't treat the diagnosis. We treat symptoms and behaviors that are part of or consequences of the diagnosis. And so I caution parents to not be so concerned about multiple diagnoses. An issue we did not discuss is the issue of polypharmacy, that accompanying these increasing number of diagnoses, it's the rule now to find children taking 2 or 3 psychiatric medications, absent much in the way of scientific research to support that. I'm not against it. I'm not a physician. I don't prescribe. But I think we need to generate research to demonstrate that a child suffering from depression and ADHD, in fact, should be taking 2 or 3 classes of medication, and that in fact they will fare better over time because of that. And whether we've demonstrated that or not remains to be seen.
Thank you so much. You mentioned we talked majority of our time about a comprehensive evaluation system, and you talked about having broadband measures, and then the various risks, strengths, impairment measures, and then the narrow-focused measures once you've sort of identified your flags from the broadband. One of the questions was, do you use this same protocol across settings? So does it matter if you're in school doing the evaluation in a school or doing the evaluation in your clinic outside of school as a private practice clinician? Does it change how you approach assessment?
Now, that's a very good question. And I will say that the primary framework I discussed today was built around a clinic setting. And the reason I say that is because a noticeable omission was, and I mentioned it, was a functional behavioral assessment. That is, going into the environment in which the child functions, and then there's a question of how many times do you go and in what different settings and what behaviors do you look at. I like to look at talking, out of seat, attention to task, and general disruption. And how do you measure it? Do you measure how many times it occurs? Do you measure it in intervals? This is a topic perhaps for another webinar, how do you observe behavior. So if I was doing this in a school setting, the difference would be I would meet with teachers before I met with parents. I would have to get permission from the parent then to begin. I would still want to meet with the parent and take a history, although a lot of people aren't able to do that, as I mentioned. And again, in a clinic setting, I don't go into the parents' homes and watch the child. It's increasingly the case now that there are ABA therapists who will come into the home and observe behavior and intervene, but they're not evaluating. So I think the broad framework applies in any setting, but there are clearly modifications and differences across settings.
Thank you so much. I think we only have time for one more question, but please keep bringing them in. It's great to get all of the questions, and if we can address them after the webinar, we will. So one question specifically about the ASRS actually was for children whose chronological age may be different from their developmental or adaptive age, is it still appropriate to use the ASRS?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I just this past week evaluated a child who's now 3.5, who was born premature, about 1.5 pounds, had a grade 2 paraventricular hemorrhage, and that child's clearly quite delayed. We determined the child was born 2.5 months before their approximate due date. And once I determined that, I then use their a full term date, and that's the date I use in my face-to-face testing. I did an ADOS with that child, and that's the date that I use in my questionnaire data. If the question is, did we use a group of children and evaluate them looking at their chronological age versus their adjusted birth weight age because they were born premature with the ASRS, the answer is no, we did not. But I do think it is valid to adjust the age and then use the questionnaire relative to the adjusted age. And I'll tell you what I do is I do both. I do both when I score the questionnaires, and I do both when I give tests, just because I'm interested in seeing the difference.
Thank you so much. So I think we have to wrap up the questions now because there's a little bit of extra information that I need to share with you today. So we're going to go back to the slides for a minute.
Let me just thank everyone. It looks like there's over 1,000 people online here. And again, I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas with you. My email and web page is there. I do answer all my email questions. You will get an answer. It may take a few days. I do a little bit of Twitter. I do a little bit of Facebook. I'm trying to get into the modern age. So again, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. So I just want to share with you that there are a number of MHS representatives that are available to support you. The next 2 slides, you'll find the maps and contact information for all of the education and clinical assessment consultants. So depending on where you're located, please feel free to contact your specific rep. They're more than happy to assist you. I believe this first slide shows the clinical and healthcare reps, and this one is your educational school district reps. I also just wanted to share with you that MHS also offers self-paced options to gain more continuing education credits. So you can visit our Learn Center for more information about those. And also just to tell you a little bit about the Learn Center, there is information on there about how you can get your credits. And for this particular webinar, like we said, you'll be sent a link after the webinar asking for a feedback survey. And once you fill out that survey, it's going to send you a link to give you all of the information for downloading your certificate. And all of the resources, including the handouts, because I know some of you have had some trouble downloading those, will be included with the link for this full recording, and that'll all come to you afterwards. And finally, I just want to thank everyone, as Dr. Goldstein has. I know everyone's time is very valuable, and it's hard to take an hour and a half away from your busy schedules to sit through a webinar, but we do appreciate you for taking the time out of your day to join us. We do hope that you found it time well spent. And thank you again, of course, to Dr. Goldstein for joining us here live in studio today. And that's all. Thank you. That's a wrap. Goodbye, everybody.